"Get out of my house, I don't need a sick daughter." That sentence hit me harder than the rain did, not because it surprised me but because it finally confirmed what I'd known my whole life: in that house I was disposable. The storm outside was loud, wind slamming the siding, rain coming down sideways, but inside it was quiet in the way that only happens right after something breaks for good. I was 15, shoes soaked, backpack half-zipped. My sister stood behind my dad with that look she always wore when she'd won. Chin lifted, eyes clean, the kind of face that tells a lie so well it almost becomes truth. She didn't say anything she didn't need to. She'd already said enough. Dad didn't ask me a single question, not one. No, is this true? No, explain yourself. He just pointed at the door like I was a stranger who'd overstayed her welcome. I remember noticing how calm his hand was. No shaking, no hesitation. That's when I understood this wasn't anger. This was a decision he'd been waiting to make. I didn't cry. That part surprises people when I tell it later. They expect tears, begging, screaming, but I didn't give him that. I just nodded once, adjusted my bag, and walked past him. As I stepped outside, the door shut behind me with a soft click, not a slam, a click, like closing a file. If you're still listening right now, take a second and stay with me. Stories like this don't start loud, but they don't end quietly either. The rain soaked through my hoodie in minutes. The road looked endless, stretched thin under flashing lightning. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I wasn't going back. 3 hours passed like that, walking, stopping under gas station awnings, sitting on cold concrete, watching cars pass like they belonged to another life. That's when the shift happened. It wasn't rage. Rage is sloppy, loud, short-lived. What settled in me was colder, cleaner, a kind of focus I'd never felt before. I realized something standing there in wet socks and borrowed courage. They all thought I was weak, my dad, my sister, everyone who'd ever watched me stay quiet, and assumed that meant I had nothing inside me. They were wrong. Growing up, I'd learned how to disappear in plain sight, be useful, be agreeable. Get good grades without showing off, keep secrets, observe. I knew how people talked when they thought I wasn't listening. I knew which smiles were fake and which silences were loaded. At 15, I didn't have money, power, or protection, but I had time and patience. I replayed the lie my sister told over and over in my head, the way she'd framed it just vague enough to sound believable, the way she'd cried on cue. I realized then she'd practiced it. Maybe not that exact version, but the skill. She'd been shaping reality for years while I'd been surviving inside it. The storm finally slowed like it had done its job. I stood there under a flickering streetlight and made myself a promise. Not out loud. Quiet promises last longer. I promised I would never correct them, never argue, never explain. I would let them keep believing exactly what they believed about me, because people are most dangerous when they think you're harmless. 3 hours after I walked out, my life split in two. There was the girl they threw away. And there was the one who started paying attention. And if you think this is where I went looking for help or mercy, you don't know me yet, because the next part is where the real story begins. I didn't go back home that night, but someone else walked straight into a future they never saw coming. That town was the kind of place where nothing ever happened and everybody knew your business anyway. One blinking traffic light. A diner that smelled like burnt coffee and nostalgia. Houses with peeling paint and stories that never changed. People there believed the world was exactly as big as their routines, and anything outside of that felt suspicious. I grew up learning how to take up as little space as possible. My sister was the bright one, the talent, the miracle kid who smiled for neighbors and collected praise like loose change. Teachers adored her. My dad bragged about her like she was an investment that had already paid off. If she messed up, it was stress. If I messed up, it was proof of something being wrong with me. When I got sick as a kid, nothing dramatic, just enough to miss school sometimes, my dad started using that word. Sick. Not worried sick, defective sick, like I was a faulty appliance that kept drawing power without doing enough work. He never said it with anger, he said it with disappointment, which somehow felt worse. I learned early that asking for help came with interest, so I stopped asking. After the night I was kicked out, I didn't disappear the way people expected. I stayed in the cracks, slept on couches, took the bus to school, worked shifts that started before sunrise and ended when the town went quiet. I kept my head down and my mouth shut. Folks looked right through me, which was perfect. If you're watching this and you've ever felt invisible, stay with me. Sometimes that's not a weakness. Sometimes it's cover. What nobody noticed was how closely I watched everything. Numbers, patterns, who owed who favors. Which adults talked too much after their third drink. Small towns run on unspoken rules, and I memorized every one of them. I saved money in places nobody would think to look. Cash tips folded tight. Gift cards traded for groceries. I learned basic tech skills from the library computers because nobody cared what I was doing as long as I wasn't causing trouble. While my sister was winning trophies, I was learning leverage. At family gatherings, when I still showed up, I sat quietly at the edge of the room. My sister would tell stories, edited versions where she was always the hero and I was barely mentioned. Dad would nod along, proud and relaxed, like the past had cleaned itself up. No one ever asked me how I was doing. That question had been removed from circulation. The lie that got me thrown out became a kind of family truth. Repeated enough times, it hardened. I could feel it every time my name came up and the room shifted just a little. They'd look at me like they were waiting for something unstable to happen. I let them. Because while they were busy managing the story, I was building something real. Quietly, piece by piece, skills first, then connections, then options. I didn't dream big out loud, I planned small in silence. By 17, I had access to things people twice my age didn't. Information, opportunities that didn't come with applause. I never corrected anyone who underestimated me. I never defended myself. I learned that silence makes people sloppy. My sister loved attention, she needed it like oxygen. Dad loved control, he needed to feel right. I wrote that down in my head and kept it there untouched like a tool waiting for the right moment. They thought the storm had erased me, that I'd been washed out of their lives for good. What they didn't realize was that storms don't erase everything. Some things grow stronger underground. And while the town kept pretending nothing had changed, I was already laying the first brick of something that would one day stand right in front of them, whether they were ready or not. By the time I turned 18, I'd learned something most people never do. Success doesn't always make noise. Sometimes it moves like a shadow, only visible if you know where to look. I was still the girl people felt sorry for, the one who didn't quite make it. The quiet reminder of a family embarrassment nobody liked to discuss too openly, and I let that version of me exist. Outwardly, my life looked small: shared rooms, cheap clothes, jobs that sounded temporary and unimpressive when people asked. I answered questions with half smiles and short sentences. I kept expectations low on purpose. When people think they understand you, they stop paying attention. Behind that, everything was different. I started saying yes to opportunities that didn't look glamorous, helping someone set up a system. Fixing problems nobody else wanted to touch, organizing things quietly, efficiently, without needing credit. People remembered that. They didn't remember my name at first, but they remembered the results. I kept notebooks, real ones, not digital, pages full of observations, habits, timelines, who panicked under pressure, who talked too much, who cut corners. I never judged it, I just recorded it. Information doesn't need emotion to be useful. Every once in a while, I'd hear about my sister, college acceptance, engagement rumors, big smiles in holiday photos posted online. Dad looked proud in every picture, chest out like he'd personally engineered her success. I studied those photos longer than I probably should have, not out of jealousy, out of curiosity. She was still lying, not always about big things. Sometimes it was small exaggerations, skipped details, rearranged timelines, the kind of lies that feel harmless until they stack. I could tell because the patterns never changed. Same posture, same words, same pauses. Meanwhile, I kept growing into someone nobody recognized. I learned how money actually moves. Not the way people talk about it, but the way it behaves. I learned how trust gets built and broken, often without anyone raising their voice. I learned that power usually belongs to the person who doesn't need to announce it. If you're still with me here, take a breath. This part matters more than you think. I crossed paths with my family less and less, but when I did, nothing about me set off alarms. That was intentional. I dressed simply, spoke gently, never corrected them when they assumed things about my life that weren't true. Dad once said, almost kindly, "I'm glad you found something that works for you." I thanked him like it was a compliment. Inside, I noted the relief in his voice, relief that I hadn't become a problem, relief that his decision years ago hadn't come back to haunt him. My sister barely looked at me when we were in the same room. She didn't need to. In her mind, she'd already won. I wasn't competition. I wasn't even part of the race. That was the mistake, because while they were comfortable, I was precise. I didn't rush. I didn't confront. I didn't demand acknowledgement. I built layers. Quiet ones, layers that didn't look like anything until they were stacked just right. There's a strange freedom in being underestimated. People tell you things they shouldn't. They make moves they think won't be noticed. They assume your silence means ignorance. It doesn't. By the time my name started circulating in rooms my family had never been invited into, I made sure it wasn't connected to them. Different version, different reputation. Clean edges, no emotional fingerprints. They still thought of me as the girl who walked into the storm and disappeared. What they didn't know was that I'd already found my footing and I was standing much closer to them than they realized. By the time I came back into their orbit, it wasn't because I needed anything. It was because I wanted proximity. Distance teaches you survival. Closeness teaches you strategy. The town hadn't changed. Same diner. Same gossip disguised as concern. Same people aging in place like furniture nobody bothered to replace. When I walked in, I felt the old eyes do that quick scan, checking for damage, weakness, proof that I'd failed exactly the way they'd predicted. I gave them nothing. I moved calmly, spoke politely, took a modest place to live and a job that sounded ordinary enough to be forgettable. People relaxed around me almost instantly. Comfort is dangerous like that. It makes people careless. My dad invited me over for dinner one night like it was an act of generosity. He talked about work, about neighbors, about how proud he was of my sister. I listened, nodded, asked the right questions. I didn't mention the storm. I didn't mention the night he pointed at the door. He liked that version of me, the quiet one, the one who didn't demand apologies or explanations. He mistook restraint for forgiveness. My sister showed up late, wearing confidence like a tailored jacket. She hugged me loosely, eyes already drifting toward the mirror. She talked about her life in highlight reels, skipping the parts that didn't fit the image. I noticed the cracks right away, little stress signals she didn't know she had, a twitch in her smile, a pause before certain names. I didn't push, I never pushed. Instead, I started helping Dad organize paperwork. Helping my sister clean up little messes she didn't want to deal with, helping neighbors with things that needed fixing but didn't feel urgent. I became useful, reliable, invisible again, but this time by choice. If you've ever wondered how people lose everything without realizing it, this is usually how it starts. I noticed things that didn't add up, accounts that overlapped when they shouldn't. Stories my sister told Dad that didn't match the ones she told other people. Timelines that shifted depending on the audience. Nothing explosive, just enough friction to create heat later. I kept my reactions neutral. Curious, not suspicious. Helpful, not confrontational. People tell you more when they think you're on their side. At night, I organized everything, cross-checked, labeled, built a quiet map of relationships and dependencies, who needed who was covering for whom, who believed which version of the truth. It wasn't obsession, it was preparation. My sister still saw me as background noise. Dad still saw me as a reminder of a decision he didn't want to revisit. Neither of them considered the possibility that I was choosing this position deliberately. That was the second mistake, because power doesn't always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes it clears the dishes and listens. The lie that got me kicked out had grown roots. It supported other lies now, bigger ones, riskier ones, lies that didn't just protect egos, they protected outcomes, money, reputation, control. I didn't feel anger when I realized that. I felt clarity. This wasn't about revenge the way movies sell it. No shouting, no confrontation, no dramatic reveal. This was about letting people continue exactly as they were, just long enough for the weight of their own choices to become unbearable. I stayed patient, smiled when expected, stayed late when asked. I let them believe I was grateful to be included again. And all the while something was taking shape beneath the surface, something that didn't need force. Something that only required timing. They thought the danger had passed years ago, back when the door clicked shut behind me. They were wrong. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It never does. It surfaced in fragments, misplaced documents, offhand comments, numbers that didn't quite line up unless you forced them to. I didn't force anything. I let the truth reveal itself at its own pace. It started with my sister asking for help she pretended not to need. She framed it casually. "You're good with details," she said, smiling like this was a compliment and not an admission. She needed me to organize some records, nothing serious, just a mess she didn't have time for. I agreed without hesitation. People always relax when you say yes too quickly. As I worked, I noticed patterns, repeated adjustments. Names appearing where they shouldn't, promises made twice and fulfilled once. She had built her life on the assumption that no one would ever look too closely. That confidence had made her lazy. The lie that got me kicked out wasn't an exception. It was a prototype. She'd been doing this for years, reshaping stories, redirecting blame, smoothing over outcomes that didn't match her claims. At first, it had been about looking impressive. Then it became about staying afloat. Now it was about survival. What made it dangerous wasn't just the scale, it was who was attached to it. My dad had tied himself to her success completely. His pride, his reputation, his sense of being right. He defended her without knowing the full story because admitting doubt would mean revisiting the night he chose to believe her over me. That kind of realization can break people or make them crueler. I kept working, quietly, methodically. I created backups of things she assumed only existed once. I cross-referenced stories she told different people and noted where they conflicted. I didn't change anything. I didn't interfere. Interference leaves fingerprints. At family dinners, she laughed a little too loud, drank a little more than usual. She was starting to feel pressure, though she didn't know why yet. Dad blamed stress. I stayed neutral. If you're still watching, understand this. The most dangerous moment isn't when someone knows they're caught, it's when they sense something's wrong but don't know where to look. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. If her version of the truth collapsed, it wouldn't just take her down. It would expose how much my dad had ignored, defended, and benefited from not asking questions. The fallout wouldn't be loud, but it would be total. That's when I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them. I wasn't going to accuse or threaten. I wasn't even going to reveal anything myself. That would make me the villain in their story, and I'd played that role before. I knew how it ended. Instead, I focused on alignment. I positioned myself so that when the truth surfaced, naturally, inevitably, it wouldn't be me standing there pointing it out. It would be their own words, their own records, their own contradictions lined up neatly like dominoes they'd set themselves. My sister still underestimated me. She joked about how quiet I was, how I'd always been like that. She trusted me because she didn't respect me. That trust was the final piece. Dad, meanwhile, started relying on me more. He liked having someone dependable who didn't challenge him. He liked that I didn't bring up the past. He told himself this meant he'd been right all along, that I'd turned out fine without him needing to apologize. I let him believe that too, because the truth doesn't need a messenger when it's heavy enough. All it needs is time. And time was something I had learned to use very, very well. By then, I wasn't collecting information anymore. I was waiting for pressure to do what pressure always does, find the weakest point. My sister started unraveling in ways she couldn't hide. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to be noticed by the people who mattered to her. She missed deadlines she'd never missed before, over-explained things no one questioned, corrected herself mid-sentence, then laughed it off like it was a joke. It wasn't fear yet, it was imbalance. She came to me more often, needed reassurance. Needed someone to tell her she was fine, that everything was under control. I did exactly that. Calm voice, steady eye contact. I told her she was doing great. People believe what they want to believe, especially when it sounds like relief. Dad noticed the tension but misunderstood it completely. He blamed outside forces, bad timing, other people's incompetence. He had built his identity around being the kind of man who backed the right horse. Accepting anything else would mean admitting he'd made the wrong call twice, once with me and once with her. So he doubled down. That's the thing about denial. It doesn't freeze people in place. It pushes them forward faster toward the edge. I adjusted nothing. I didn't leak anything. I didn't warn anyone. I simply made sure that when questions came, and they were coming, they would land in the open, not in the dark where stories could be reshaped. I stepped back from helping my sister just enough to feel natural, not a withdrawal, just distance. She noticed. People always do when their safety net loosens. She asked if everything was okay between us. I smiled and said, "Of course." That answer haunted her more than anger ever would have. At night, I slept better than I had in years, not because I felt justified, but because everything was finally honest. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to their choices. I was simply allowing them to play out. If you've ever wondered how someone's world collapses without a single blow being struck, this is it. No force, no threats, just gravity. The first crack showed when two versions of the same story collided in the same room. Different audience, same speaker. She didn't realize it until the silence stretched too long. Someone asked a follow-up question she wasn't prepared for. Dad looked at her the way he used to look at me, confused, irritated, searching for the flaw. I stayed still. From there, it accelerated. Not fast enough to feel like chaos, slow enough to feel like inevitability. Conversations started happening without her. Decisions got delayed. Confidence drained out of her posture like air from a tire. She confronted me once quietly in a hallway, asked if I thought people were turning on her. I told her the truth, carefully trimmed. People notice patterns. She laughed, but it came out wrong. Dad began calling me more, asking what I thought. I answered honestly but selectively. I never accused, I never defended. I reflected his own doubts back to him in his own words. That's when his face started going pale, not with shock but with recognition. Recognition is worse, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And in that moment, I knew something important. The fall wouldn't need me at the center of it. All I had to do was step aside and let them see each other clearly for the first time. The final exposure wasn't far now. It was already lining itself up. I didn't plan the moment it all came apart. That's the truth. Planning makes people sloppy because they start expecting fireworks. I didn't need fireworks, I needed witnesses. Small towns don't have stages, but they do have rooms where reputations are quietly decided. Board meetings, fundraisers, community gatherings where smiles are polite and memories are long. My sister lived for those rooms. Dad thrived in them. They were where his certainty stayed intact. I made sure I was present but unremarkable. I dressed plainly, arrived early, took a seat near the edge like I always did. People nodded at me with that vague kindness reserved for someone they don't feel threatened by. Perfect. My sister was glowing that night, confident again. The pressure had eased just enough to make her reckless. Dad sat beside her, relaxed, proud, already rehearsing the story of how he'd always known she'd succeed. The conversation started simple. Updates, plans, applause. Then someone asked a question that shouldn't have been dangerous but was. She answered without thinking. Another person followed up, referencing a detail she'd shared earlier with them. Same topic, different version. The air shifted, not dramatically, just enough. Dad leaned forward. She laughed it off, adjusted, corrected herself. Too fast? I watched the room instead of her. That's where the truth shows up first. People stopped nodding. Someone glanced down at their notes. Another looked up, curious now, not impressed. If you're watching this, pause for a second. This is the part where silence starts doing the work. More questions came, still polite, still calm. Each one required her to remember which version she'd told to whom. She couldn't, not anymore. The web was too wide. Dad finally spoke, asked for clarification. She looked at him for help. He didn't give it. That was the moment his face drained of color, not panic, not anger, realization. He recognized the tone. He'd heard it before, years ago, from me. The room didn't explode. It didn't need to. All it did was turn attentive. Attentive rooms are dangerous. They don't forget. She finished speaking, but it didn't matter. The words had lost weight. They floated instead of landing. When the meeting moved on, people didn't look at her the same way. They didn't look away either. They looked through. Afterward, conversations split off naturally, quietly, without announcements. Dad stood still, like someone trying to remember which step came next. My sister avoided my eyes completely. No one accused, no one confronted. That's what made it permanent. Outside, the night air felt lighter than I expected. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Like I'd set something down after carrying it too long. Someone brushed past me and said, "You were right earlier." I hadn't said anything earlier, I just nodded. Dad didn't come home right away. When he did, he didn't speak much. He poured a drink he didn't finish, sat in the dark longer than usual. For the first time, he didn't look certain. My sister locked herself in her room. Phones stopped buzzing the way they used to. Attention evaporates fast when it senses instability. And me, I went to bed and slept deeply, because the cruelest part wasn't what happened in that room, it was knowing they'd replay it forever alone, realizing no one had attacked them. They'd done it themselves. The days after were quieter than I expected, not peaceful, just hollow, the kind of quiet that follows a noise only the people involved can still hear. My sister stopped leaving the house as much. When she did, she moved differently, shoulders tight, smile delayed by half a second. She checked reflections like they might betray her. People were still polite, but politeness had replaced warmth. Invitations came with fewer details. Conversations ended sooner than planned. Nothing had been announced. Nothing had been proven. That was the brilliance of it. Dad tried to hold things together through routine, same coffee mug, same chair, same drive. But routines only work when they're reinforced by belief, and his had cracked. I could see him replaying memories in real time, testing them for weight. The night he kicked me out came up often. I could tell by the way his jaw tightened when he saw me. He wanted to ask, he never did. I stayed exactly the same. Same tone, same posture, same distance. I didn't comfort, I didn't judge, I didn't fill the silence. Silence is honest when you let it breathe. People started coming to me, not dramatically, not directly, just little check-ins, questions framed as curiosity. You've always been observant, haven't you? I smiled and changed the subject. If you're still here, understand this part clearly. The revenge wasn't in their loss, it was in my absence from it. My sister tried once to reclaim control. She hosted a small gathering, nothing formal, just familiar faces. She told stories with extra energy, laughed louder than usual, corrected herself too often. Everyone noticed. No one said a word. Dad watched from the corner like a man trying to spot a fire before it spread. He didn't intervene. He didn't defend, he was tired. Later that night, he knocked on my door. He stood there longer than necessary before speaking, said my name like he was testing how it sounded. Then he asked me a question he should have asked years ago. Why didn't you fight back? I thought about all the answers I could give him, the anger he deserved, the truth he wasn't ready for. Instead, I gave him the only one that mattered. Because I didn't need to. That was when his shoulders finally dropped, not in relief, in defeat. He nodded slowly, like a man admitting something only to himself. He didn't apologize, that would have required courage he didn't have. But something in him shifted permanently. My sister heard about the conversation. I know because she confronted me later, eyes sharp, voice controlled. She asked what I'd told him. I told her the truth. Nothing you didn't already know. She stared at me for a long time, really looked at me. For the first time, she saw the version of me that wasn't small, wasn't lost, wasn't sick. The version she couldn't rewrite. Fear isn't loud when it's real. It's quiet, careful. After that, she avoided me completely. The town moved on the way towns do, slowly, selectively. My sister's name still came up, but with pauses now. Dad's confidence never fully returned, and I stepped back out of the picture just as quietly as I'd stepped in. No announcement, no farewell. Some people thought I'd forgiven them, others thought I'd disappeared again. Both were wrong. I had simply finished what I came to do. I left town the same way I'd learned to do everything important in my life, without asking permission and without making a scene. There was no dramatic goodbye, no last conversation that tied things up neatly. I packed my things early in the morning when the streets were quiet and honest. The diner lights were still on, the traffic lights still blinking like it always had. The town didn't notice me leaving. That felt right. Closure doesn't always come from words, sometimes it comes from distance. Months passed, then more. I heard things secondhand, the way stories travel when they're no longer protected. My sister's world didn't collapse all at once, it shrank. Opportunities stopped calling back, trust thinned out. People remembered inconsistencies they'd once ignored. She worked harder for less and couldn't understand why. Dad aged faster than time should allow, not physically, internally. The certainty drained out of him. He still defended his choices when pressed, but the conviction wasn't there anymore. He knew now, not everything, just enough. He reached out once. A message, carefully worded, no apology, no explanation, just an update about his life, like we were distant relatives instead of father and daughter. I read it. I didn't reply. That was my answer. Here's the thing people misunderstand about revenge. They think it's about watching someone suffer. It isn't. It's about reclaiming the version of yourself that was taken from you and refusing to hand it back. I didn't ruin my sister. She did that by believing she could keep rewriting reality forever. I didn't break my dad. He did that the night he chose certainty over truth. All I did was stop protecting them from the consequences of who they were. And in doing that, I freed myself. I don't tell this story because I'm proud of the outcome. I tell it because I'm proud of the restraint. Because I learned that power doesn't need permission and strength doesn't need volume. I stayed low. I worked quietly. I let time and truth do what force never could. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or erased by someone who thought you were small, remember this: staying calm isn't weakness. Silence isn't surrender. And walking away doesn't mean you lost. Sometimes it means you're finally in control. They thought the storm broke me. It didn't. It taught me exactly who I was.